you've also in your work written and spoken about the other side, which is getting involved in the politics of other nations. So you've talked about how the State Department or the CIA more specifically are involved in the Arab Spring.
Yep.
I've also read, I don't know if it's through you, about the CIA backing the Maidan coup in 2014 in Ukraine. So there's a kind of the financial backing, big business aspect to this, but there's also a political aspect to it.
Of course. Well,
so what are the motivations there? If the motivations for the finance is financial, it's class, it's wanting to have a certain life on the individual level of those people in the State Department. What is the motivation behind the political backings of their behavior, their actions overseas?
I would call that financial as well, because the two are, again, inextricably linked. The State Department and the CIA are remarkably agnostic about the moral affinity for a particular movement. For example, in the 1970s, the State Department and the CIA basically built the Mujahideen cause in Afghanistan. These were Islamic fundamentalists, hardcore against every American value about open society and freedom and liberty and religious tolerance and all of this. These were militant, fundamentalist, religious fundamentalist groups who our national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, descended from a helicopter to give you can look this up on YouTube, Zbigniew Brzezinski's speech to the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all of that has its origins in essentially CIA-sponsored paramilitary groups regionally in order to fight the Cold War. At the time, Russia was occupying Central Asia and Afghanistan, and if we could run military arms to a paramilitary terror group to make it costly to the Russian military to kick them out of regions that they were exploiting the natural resources of, it would economically and militarily cripple Russian operations, the Russian economy, the Russian military capacity all over the world. And so we sponsored and almost made a kind of, ideological love song in a way that's sort of tongue-in-cheek, in the sense that if you watch this, Zbigniew Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. It's effectively the head of the whole intelligence community from the White House perspective. And so, this is the person who ultimately the State Department and CIA activities in the region are going to have to get approval from. And, he's telling the Mujahideen, your cause is our cause. Your cause is righteous. God is on your side. You have the undying support of the American people. We will support you in this. Now, didn't mean we loved Islamic fundamentalism. They were our useful tools that we used for a purpose. Same thing with the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. In 2014, the U.S. government, our Congress, formally sanctioned the Azov Battalion, forbid federal funds from flowing to them. They were kicked off of Facebook as a so-called dangerous organization because they had their roots in Nazis. They Nazi regalia, Nazi songs, and the whole thing was as right-wing extremist as you could possibly, you couldn't caricature it, worse than what it was in that regard, from the open society, sort of small L liberal statecraft of our open society doctrine at state. But when
I don't know what that means.
Well, what that
open
means,
society doctrine.
Well, open society is a concept.
Do you mean the Soros open?
Well, yes, he does have the Open Society Foundation, but this links to a sort of moral tenet of American diplomacy, which is that since Woodrow Wilson in the 1910s, we've had this kind of blank check to make the world safe for democracy. This was one of the reasons that the blob, the foreign policy establishment, thinks that Woodrow Wilson is our greatest president, better than George Washington, Abe Lincoln, Barack Obama. Woodrow Wilson is the president of, our founding father, if you will, of the blob, because he basically declared this doctrine that the role of America in the world is to make the whole rest of the world safe for democracy, meaning that gives us a purview to go into any country said to be under the thumb of authoritarianism and liberate those people to bring them an open society rather than a closed one. Open meaning it has open markets, an open, free, private, free enterprise financial system, open political participation, multicultural pluralism, breaking up sort of hegemonic and nationalistic structures within a country. And this
so he's the founding father of neoconservatism.
Yes, and also neoliberalism.
Right.
This is why there is this sort of bipartisan alliance around the Wilsonian edict of open society, and this is why George Soros's operations fit so perfectly in tandem with CIA activity in the region or State Department activity in the region. And in fact, they often will sort of co-sponsor each other's work, so to speak, where open society grantees will get USAID money and they'll get State Department grants. And it will be these same sort of Soros universities or NGOs that will effectively serve as assets for CIA activity in the region. They see this in Ukraine and Arab Spring, where you have these same Soros networks working with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is our most prolific CIA cutout. We can get to the specifics of all this if you're interested.
What does cutout mean?
A cutout means something it's a cutout of something else that spawned it. So, for example, when the CIA goes into Cuba or Venezuela to influence the internal politics of the region, or to try to regime change its government, or try to control a particular industrial sector, the CIA doesn't march in with a bunch of, name badges that say, "Hi, my name is Mike Benz. I work for the CIA. Here's my W-2 form showing that I work for the CIA." What they do is they create front groups, shell companies, a whole variety of facade organizations, whether they're parked in university centers, whether they're parked in government-organized non-governmental organizations, GONGOs or NGOs, whether they're parked in private sector companies, or pop-up companies, or specifically, or cells of a particular allied private corporation. There's any number of forms that this can take, but they are cut out of the CIA when they do that. They are not their own entity. They were set up for a purpose, and they serve that purpose.
And the National Endowment Fund.
Yes, the National Endowment for Democracy is sort of the premier CIA cutout. It was created in 1983 in a letter from our CIA director at the time, William Colby, who wrote a letter to the head of Ronald Reagan, who was the president, Ronald Reagan's Justice Department, calling for the creation of a National Endowment for Democracy to do the kinds of CIA work that the CIA was doing from the 1950s until the 1970s, but that they got in a lot of trouble for doing during our 1975 and 1976 Church Committee hearings, which was a big scandal for our CIA. Their name was dirt because left-wing groups were really mad at the CIA because the CIA was infiltrating student movements on U.S. campuses. There was something called Operation Chaos, which was basically a CIA. Again, these are their own names, just like the FBI called it Crossfire Hurricane against Trump. But to infiltrate the National Students Association and unions and other left-wing groups that were anti-war, because the CIA and the U.S. military and the State Department depended on home support for the war. Let me know if this sounds familiar, by the way, today with Ukraine. But in order for if you don't have money to pay for that war, you lose the war. Even if you've got a bigger military, you can't fund it. You can't fund your mercenary army. You can't fund the tanks. Every missile costs you $1 million. So you need the American people's support within the House of Representatives in order to fund the war. So you can lose a war in the political realm. Our sort of doctrine on this is there's 4 theaters of war. You have the strategic, the logistical, the tactical, and the political. There's 4 ways to win or lose a war. You can lose it because you got the strategy right or wrong. You can lose it because you got the tactics right or wrong. You can lose it because the logistics went well or not well, or you can lose it because your political support, fell out. And so you lack the funding, or you lack the mandate or the jurisdiction to actually continue the war. And this is why we spend a lot of time when we are in a either declared or undeclared war with another country, manipulating their internal politics to build up their anti-war movements, to lessen their own home support for the war, so that their military has less capacity. But running this back, the National Endowment for Democracy was created in a letter from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, saying we used to have this capacity to coordinate with all these different pro-democracy groups, all these different dissident groups. And we lost that capacity during the Carter administration from 1976 to 1980, something called the Halloween Massacre, where Jimmy Carter fired 30% of the entire CIA operations directorate in a single night, because he rode to power effectively on the scandals of the intelligence community's abuse of the Democrat Party. It's now the shoe is sort of on the other foot in America now, and for essentially the same reasons. And so when Ronald Reagan won in 1980, and also, there's something called the Iran hostage crisis, which was sort of provided this political perceived need to bring back our strong CIA cloak and dagger type work to prevent another Iran hostage type situation. The pitch from our CIA director was, we need the same power back that we had from the late 1940s until the 1970s. We need to roll back the restrictions on the CIA that were put in place by the Carter administration, but we don't have the political mandate right now. Congress is divided. Democrats were in power in Congress, even though, Reagan, controlled the presidency. We're not going to call it the CIA when we do this now. We're going to create something called the National Endowment for Democracy, and it will do the work that the CIA used to do, but instead of it being a covert operation that operates under our cloak of plausible deniability, it will be a private sector NGO that will do democracy promotion work. And we will simply call our support for CIA-backed dissident groups democracy promotion instead of regime change.
Which is a completely paradoxical name, because it's been working against democracy in almost every case.
Well, this is the big joke, that democracy is the top threat to democracy. But if you frame things as a contest about bringing democracy to something, then you can argue that if a country's democratically elected leadership violates democratic norms and principles, then you can justify a overthrow of that country's government because the people were suffering under authoritarianism. Even though it came in the form of a democratically elected government, it doesn't have enough democracy. You need the revolution, you need the democracy promotion to give them a real democracy. And this is what happened in Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 was democratically elected, but he was overthrown with $5 billion in democracy promotion aid from the State Department and USAID and, the National Endowment for Democracy in order to capacity build this regime change apparatus in the name of democracy promotion, because they were arguing, that the people's will was not being respected by the government. And, there were a lot of, things there between in terms of what was really going on, but, effectively, there was, our State Department was making the argument that, that the Ukrainian government is a different thing than the Ukrainian people. It's not representing the people. The people want to join the EU. The people want to join NATO. The people want to sign on to this new IMF deal that would privatize all of their industries and sell them off to Western stakeholders. They don't want to be a part of the Russian customs trade agreement.
Even though they had just elected a leader who was Russia-facing.
Yes. And in fact, Yanukovych signed multiple $10 billion deals with Western energy companies. It's my personal opinion that Yanukovych was not some Russian puppet. He did some Russia favorable things, but the country was half Russian. The entire eastern half of the country is overwhelmingly majority Russian ethnic. The country is sort of divided, as was East-West Germany during the Cold War, into sort of two totally different halves, and they tend to vote. The Western half tends to vote for the Western-backed, candidate, and the Eastern one tends to vote for the sort of, Russia axis type candidate. And that is the natural flow of that democracy because of its demographics and because of its geography.
I wouldn't say they're completely different. They're somewhat different. There's ethnic differences, there's language differences,
right.
But they have some concept of shared nationality.
Right. They do. But we interfered with that in a huge way. It was the U.S. State Department and our collage of CIA cutouts through something called the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which was, David Kramer and a lot of people who had emerged during Russiagate John McCain played a big role in. They issued to Zelensky, I think his first month in office, something called the Red Lines Memo, where they threatened the incoming Zelensky administration with, quote, political instability if the administration crossed any of the something like 50 or 60 red lines for the government not to cross. Otherwise, this almost 100 signatories of State Department and USAID grantee and CIA cutout organizations and George Soros organizations, all signed in this open letter representing, effectively tens of thousands of people between all their institutions who could all take to the streets, do these rent-a-riots, and destabilize the country if the government took any of these actions on economic grounds, on security grounds, on media grounds, and on culture grounds. And one of those was, allowing the use of the Russian language on TV stations and in educations. I mean, the U.S. government effectively forbade the newly installed, Ukrainian government from allowing the Russian language to be spoken in Ukraine, where, as you mentioned, there was this, there was a sort of shared, Ukrainian national identity, but there were a lot of dialects. There were a lot of these, the Russian East, still used the Russian language and a lot of Russian sort of affinity cultural institutions. But in an attempt to bring the entire country into an unalloyed sort of NATO vassal state, we leaned on them to change their whole culture. They had to turn over their whole education ministry over to the EU. This, there's a lot of sort of funny stories about, some of the deep machinations of this also. I don't know how deep on this topic you want to go, but, this is an example where there are a huge amount of financial interests in Ukraine. I don't think that we support the Azov Battalion now and how they were welcomed in Congress and how they were restored on Facebook. They're no longer a so-called dangerous organization. They've got their free speech rights. They all of their sins against open society and against liberalism were cleansed because they were a useful pawn in the grand chess game of seizing Eurasia from Russia and other countries, and in the sort of Eurasian subcontinent. And so any asset, regardless of ideology, that's useful to that gets our money, becomes the hero of the day, and we will throw them, under the bus the moment they stop becoming useful. In the same way that, the U.S. worked with Noriega before we threw him out. The U.S. worked with Saddam Hussein before we threw him out. The U.S. worked with the Bin Laden family. I mean, this is a tale as old as time. It's not really about the ideology, left or right. There's no such thing as an extremist group in that sense. It's, are you useful or not?
Am I right in understanding you think that the motivation, even for this aspect, is still money? Because, they've been throwing billions into this. And so how they measure a return on that, it's kind of hard to fully understand. It makes more sense in your earlier part of the argument when they're supporting big corporations, big businesses like the oil businesses. But when it comes to this, when they're throwing billions upon billions into these foreign affairs, foreign situations, foreign wars, how do they imagine they're getting back? Or, and this is the other opinion, are they sort of religious about spreading democracy? Are they religious about this open society as, the George Soros vision of the world, liberalism eternally, and liberalism conquering all these other ideologies? How are you landing on it being financial there?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer this. I think what I was going to say until the very latter, part of what you said is, of course, it's financial. The religious maps onto the finances. The religion becomes flexible, and people's religion tends to change when you wave lots of money in front of them. Think about this with the Democratic Party in the U.S., right? You have right now Congress divided on this Ukraine aid issue, where the international sort of global Chamber of Commerce wing of the Republican Party is very much for Ukraine aid. These are people like the Bush family and the Cheney family and Mitt Romney and the John McCain networks. These GOP conservative, legacy families and networks within the Republican Party want $1 trillion effectively in Ukraine aid. We've already given something like $300 billion, over the course of the past 2 years, and put an inordinate amount of pressure on individual members of Congress for the most recent $60 billion aid, Ukraine aid infusion. But the Republican Party is basically split half and half now between the sort of populist nationalist wing, which does not want to keep providing Ukraine aid. We want that money to go towards helping Americans. And then you have this internationalist faction within the GOP who doesn't really care about nationalism, populism issues. They care about international industry and the American empire rather than the American homeland, and they are voting for that. But the majority gets passed because half of the Republican Party teams up with the entire Democrat Party. There was not a single person on the Democrats who voted against Ukraine aid. Not the sort of neoliberal, Hillary Clinton aligned type, classical Democrats that way. But not, interestingly, not the Bernie Sanders, not the AOC types, not the people who are identitarian. Think about this. Ukraine, these groups got sanctioned by Democrats in 2014 as being Nazi groups, white, ethno-nationalist, hardcore right wing. Ukraine is a hardcore right wing state. They don't want LGBT, cultural imports. They don't want, mass immigration. They are, they're an ethnic group that we would say in the United States is the highest level of privilege and, sort of this, almost the face of settler colonialism. All of these things that you hear the Democrats talk about in this country as being, their biggest issue. Not a single Democrat dissented from taking money. That $300 billion could have gone to inner city African-American communities. It could have gone to providing free medical, free health insurance for the Bernie Sanders socialist left. It could have gone towards debt forgiveness on student loans. We have a big debt crisis for young people. You would expect that Democrats ideologically are saying that $300 billion, there's a Tupac Shakur, the rapper who was murdered in 1994. They got money for the war, but they can't feed the poor. That was a left-wing anti-war slogan. And you would think that, but not a single one voted against that. What I'm describing here is you would think if it was about ideology, that any of these other things would come into play than funding a hardcore right-wing, Nazi-adjacent paramilitary faction in order to fight a foreign war 5,000 miles away, and especially when they're fighting for scraps already from the fact that they are all kept in line by Democrat Party leadership. And they're beholden on that leadership for their committees and for their own appropriations on their own pet things, means they are in good standing with the blob, and they can get their cut as long as they give the blob theirs. And so that religiosity about these things ebbs and flows. And there's
another irony, which is that before this recent war started, if you look at newspaper headlines, they were regularly saying how corrupt Ukraine was and how corrupt Zelensky was.
Right.
And that's been completely forgotten. There's one thing as you speak that comes to mind is that a lot of the things you're saying, the corruption of the blob, the corruption of the CIA and the State Department, these are things that I remember hearing people like Noam Chomsky and the left saying, and they've been saying this for decades. It seems curious now that you're saying it's all of the left are supporting it, and half of the right in America, half the Republicans would. What do you make of that change? How is it that it's shifted so dramatically? I guess you might say there are some people still on the left who stuck by the principles. In this country, be George Galloway, who would still maintain this worldview.
Jeremy Corbyn, too.
Jeremy Corbyn. I suspect Noam Chomsky would also agree in the States. But what do you make about this general huge Overton window shift?
I actually think it's a natural consequence of the shift of who's targeted. In the 20th century, the left, that there was a identical constellation of variables, but just with the table reversed. You had Republicans who were 100% the war party, 100% the oil and gas party, 100% the International Chamber of Commerce party, because culturally, the left sort of had control of academia and had control of Hollywood and newspapers and unions. The thing that balanced out all of that huge cultural dominance of the left and that led to relative parity between the Democrat and Republican Party in the 20th century was the fact that the right had corporations. The corporations wanted low taxes. They didn't want all this huge social welfare. They didn't want regulation. They were free market, free enterprise, low taxes. And they relied on the international battering ram of the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department to secure their markets. And so the CIA, the CIA and the State Department and the NGOs and the Defense Department were the Republican Party's best friend politically. They were the biggest backers, the biggest financiers. They were the motor engine of it. And the target of those government operations, effectively sponsored by these corporate and financial firms who were conservative at the time, was to target left-wing socialist states. And this is because, it's really not. This is one of these things.
Venezuela is the classic example.
Venezuela, Cuba. I mean, there's a million. Between Europe, Latin America,
and Italy, when the communist regime at the end after the war.
Right. Yep. The 1948 election. That was the first election that the CIA ever rigged. In January 18th, 1948. That was what kicked off our whole doctrine of the inauguration of organized political warfare was in rigging that. But you had this situation where socialist countries, the main gripe that the corporate world had against left-wing socialism, communism, was that it nationalized industry. Venezuela sits on these huge oil and gas supplies. You have these countries in the lithium triangle which sit on huge amounts of lithium. You had these Soviet-aligned Central African countries that were aligned with that were communist in the 20th century, and they sat on 85% of the world's cobalt. You had the same thing, with all the industrial sector from Western Europe all the way into Central and Eastern Europe, with all the resources and trade in Europe, and when you have socialist communist control of industry or resources, that means the government owns it. And that means it's not owned by Wall Street or London firms or corporations. And so it's just money for the taking if you can grab it. If you can overturn that government and privatize those industries, you basically loot it like a pirate robbing a ship. This is, famously what our shock therapy doctrine in Russia was in the 1990s. We in America, we refer to something called the end of history from 1991 to 1999, which was, we just won the Cold War. Boris Yeltsin was the sort of drunk puppet president of Russia who did everything that we asked. Famously in 1993, before Yeltsin bombed his own parliament building and went to war with his own government to rule it with an iron hand, he was sending fax messages to the National Endowment for Democracy, our CIA cutout, asking for their permission and giving them updates along the way. I mean, he was a sock puppet. I mean, there's even a Hollywood movie based on a true story with Jeffrey Goldblum, the guy from Jurassic Park. It's called Spinning Boris, about how Boris Yeltsin was polling at 6% ahead of the 1996 Russian election, and the U.S. sent entire delegations to basically run his entire campaign for him, and to bring the razzle dazzle of Hollywood and bring in all of these institutions and USAID money and flooding the whole zone in order to create a sort of fake electorate to keep their puppet in power, because Boris Yeltsin was going through what they called shock therapy. It was like $2 trillion worth of publicly held wealth sitting in the Soviet communist government, because the government held all the money for all the industry, the oil and gas industry, all of the rare earths and precious minerals, all of the different military contractors, the whole economy, not just of Russia, but of the entire Soviet Union, was held effectively centrally by the Russian Federation. So if you had a puppet in place running the Russian Federation, you privatize those industries, which means all that money goes for sale at fire sale prices to George Soros's Renaissance Fund and Bill Browder. It's the same people. These same people who are involved today. They are, it's amazing the family connections. They or their, or their fathers, or their, or the whole Bush network ran through that. It's amazing the same characters in Ukraine and Russia today were present during that period in the 1990s, and were making their money by effectively privatizing in the name of stopping left-wing communism. Now, these were left-wing groups, George Soros.
So what's the change now? Why is it that the left supports this stuff?
The change is because right-wing populism presents the same threat from the right-wing flank to the blob that left-wing socialism communism does. It's, populism at its heart is about the will of the people overcoming institutional consensus and putting their own welfare before that of the institutions, which manifests itself as nationalism. That is, take Hungary, right? Hungary is a country that is under a huge amount of pressure from the European Union. Just last week, it was announced they got hit with a $200 million immediate fine and $1 million a day or something fine for every day they don't comply with bringing in mass immigration, open borders type asylum into Hungary. So they're paying a huge economic penalty for their nationalist posture to maintain the heritage and the social cohesion of Hungary. At the same time, they're being punished on the, in a myriad of different ways by the EU in terms of, economic investment into it. They need to hit certain milestones. They basically foreclosed from various different financial opportunities from their West because the strings attached, or they need to open their society to get that money. So they've turned to China as an economic lifeline because China is offering that infrastructure in those loans without forcing them to do these values-based changes, these open society type changes. And that is why the first thing you see when you get off the Budapest airport is a sign for the Chinese renminbi. And the tallest building in the main square in Budapest is the Bank of China, because they've had to turn to them because the alternative is getting, their economic livelihood squeezed out of them by the US, the UK, the EU, and all of these Western stakeholders. Now, what is getting them to do that? That they are putting nationalism ahead of globalism. If they just wanted the money, they'd take the money and bring in the immigrants, bring in the LGBT, they'd turn over their education system the same way Ukraine was forced to a EU credentialing body. So all their kids would be reading about, how they need to become transgender, and there would be transgender pride parades, every month, the TV programming would all basically be inflected by, U.S. State Department type. And it would be in our interest because that would break up their nationalist, nature and bring them effectively more on board a globalist posture. But nationalism is the only force strong enough to successfully confront globalism. And there's two forms of nationalism that takes. One of them is from the left-wing flank of the blob, and the other one is from the right-wing flank. Economic nationalism, is actually a lot of what communism and socialism manifests it as, in the sense that the government takes control of the national economy, but that means that national government does, not an international super body, and they rule it with an iron fist against their own internal dissidents, but also against BlackRock, also against the United Nations, also against London banks and all portfolio companies, that involved with them. And so the blob has a right wing and a left wing flank. That socialist communist one because of the nationalization of industry, and the right wing one on cultural and social and sometimes ethnic and a variety of other sort of values based grounds. But both of them result in foreign corporations not being able to penetrate it. They take pride in their own national corporations, their own national champions. Microsoft, is not dominating Hungary. They're building their own institutions on right-wing populist, right-wing nationalist grounds. And so when that spreads like wildfire, it's the same result as left-wing. But the thing is that left-wing socialism has been successfully contained. It was the top target of the CIA and U.S. and British intelligence in the 20th century. There have been flare-ups Jeremy Corbyn, for example, but he was targeted by NATO the same way. They ran tons of operations against Jeremy Corbyn. They ran tons of operations against Bernie Sanders when he was flirting with power in 2016 in the U.S. They ran a similar Russiagate thing against him. If you remember, there was something called the superdelegates situation where the DNC basically internally manipulated things to stop his rise against Hillary Clinton. So that left-wing flank threat exists, but it's never gotten to real power in the 21st century in the way that right-wing populism has with Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Vox Party in Spain, Matteo Salvini in Italy, the AfD Party in Germany. You can argue Modi in India. This right-wing populism is the new left-wing communism from the perspective of the CIA and the State Department.